so I can look for all of those little nuggets that are Daphne du Maurier. The Body of Teenager Tom Jeffrey. So she wrote The Flight Attendant. No, she did not write The Flight Attendant. And then I've got some books that I have on my bookshelf that I have not yet read. Anyone know what time is? Hi everybody, it's Audrey and welcome back to Chapter and Converse, and welcome to another book recommendation video. So you guys know that I am legit obsessed with listening to podcasts. So I pulled together a bunch of books that feature podcasts for recommendations today. And I am once again also so completely thrilled to be working with Book of the Month on today's video. But before we dive into all the amazingness of Book of the Month themselves, you guys, Book of the Month just launched their own podcast called Virtual Book Tour. So the podcast is hosted by two members of the Book of the Month editorial team, Brianna Goodman and Jared McFarlane, and they are interviewing Book of the Month authors at their headquarters in front of a live audience. So you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, you can subscribe on Spotify. It's already #1 on Apple's new arts podcast and #4 for Spotify's arts charts, which is absolutely amazing. They have interviews with authors Adriana Trigiani and with Kelly Garrett, and you get to hear about their writing process, where they get their ideas from, their origin stories, just fun anecdotes, easy conversation. And I'm hooked. I'm already hooked. I'm already subscribed. I'm already gonna get notified whenever new episodes are available, because to me, you guys know, I love it from a reader standpoint and I love it from a writer standpoint. And it's just like best news ever. One more thing to add to my list of creative influences and inspirations that I can just dive right into. And speaking of diving right into, let's talk about Book of the Month. So they are a super popular, fast-growing online book service for readers. Every month their team vets hundreds of titles and they curate a collection of new titles, of early release titles, by authors you know and love, by new and emerging voices, and that way you can spend your time reading. They do all the research and all the hard work for you. And also, it's totally risk-free. So you can skip any month, anytime. You're not gonna get charged for it, but you can get your first box for only $9.99 using the code SUMMER. So I will include the code down below, a link to their website, a link to their podcast information so you can check that out as well. Like I said, I already checked it out. Of course, I listened to Kelly Garrett because she is the thriller writer of it all. She wrote Like a Sister, which was a Book of the Month feature. And it's just so cool that they're doing this and they're continuing to expand their brand and expand their offerings. I just think it's the coolest thing. So what's also totally cool is one of my most anticipated books of the summer, The Lies I Tell by Julie Clark, is one of this month's selections. So her last book, The Last Flight, was also a Book of the Month selection. We've got mystery thriller going on here. We have multiple points of view. We've got multiple timelines, everything I want in a mystery thriller book, tied in with an author that I know and love. So in this one we have, it says Meg Williams, Maggie Littleton, Melody White. Different names for the same person, depending on the town, depending on the job. She's a con artist who becomes whoever you want her to be. And then we have a woman named Kat Roberts who's been waiting 10 years for the woman who upended her life to return. And now that she has, Kat's determined to be the one to expose her. So twisted domestic thriller, all the things I want out of a book. And like I said, an author that I know and love. So jazzed about this. I am always gonna go knee deep into the thriller selection with Book of the Month, and I am thrilled beyond all belief to have this one. Thank you again to Book of the Month for sponsoring today's video. Now let's get into some book recommendations of books featuring podcasts in honor of Book of the Month launching Virtual Book Tour. So I have some books that I've read that I think you guys are totally gonna love, and then I have some books that I haven't read yet that I'm totally hoping I'm going to love, including another of this month's Book of the Month selections. So the first book I wanted to talk about, again, as fate would have it, is one of this month's Book of the Month selections, and it's Things We Do in the Dark by Jennifer Hillier. So if you guys have followed me for even a minute, then you know Jennifer Hillier is one of my most favorite authors, and I was so ridiculously excited when I found out that this was going to be one of this month's selections. I am so jazzed for her, and I am so jazzed for this book, you guys. So this book features a podcast in it. So I have talked about this book in my most anticipated releases coming out this year, all the things, and I will still keep my description brief because I very much feel like you need to go into a thriller a bit on the blind side. But in this one, we follow a woman named Paris, and when the book opens, she is found bloody, holding a straight razor, standing next to the body of her dead husband. And she very much immediately gets arrested and is accused of her husband's murder. But for Paris, going to jail is sort of the least of her worries. And she's more concerned that the publicity around her being accused of killing her husband, who is a very famous comedian, is going to threaten to unravel the life she's created for herself, and all of her secrets that she has very carefully crafted over the years are going to come out and expose who she really is. So there is a podcast element to this book that is called Things We Do in the Dark, and that's where it ties in. And you guys, this is just such a great book, and I absolutely loved it so much. Jennifer Hillier does such a great job of weaving together really interesting mysteries, really solid twists and thrillers and suspects, and also creating very complex characters. And there is always a degree of messiness. There is a degree of authenticity to her characters. And even in the darkest of moments, I find there is a degree of relatability to her characters. But I totally love this book. I thought it was so well done. And again, anything with a podcast, you know that I am there for it. The next book I want to recommend is Sadie by Courtney Summers. And I really feel like this is the gold standard when it comes to podcast books. And I really think this is one of the first that I read that really used the element of the podcast as part of the story structure. And this is a book where I think hands down, the audiobook is beyond tremendous. It is a fully fleshed out cast of characters, and it elevates the podcast element to such a level that I can't even begin to like rave about it enough. It's like the Daisy Jones of audiobooks when it comes to podcasts. But you get everything from like the sound of the diner door being closed and the bell ringing and the plates in the background. And again, a fully fleshed out cast of characters doing the audio of it, that it's so well done. But the book in and of itself is amazing. So whether you read it or listen to it, you're in good hands. So in this one, we follow some multiple timelines, and we have a girl named Sadie. So she's 19 years old. So this is sort of on the cusp of YA, new adult. I would kind of argue this is more on the adult side of things, but I feel like it was initially classified as YA. But Sadie's younger sister, Maddie, was murdered, and Sadie is on the hunt to find out who killed her sister. So she has been sort of deemed a runaway, and she is on the go trying to follow the clues to lead her to her sister Maddie's murderer. And our podcaster in this one is named West McCrae, and he gets a tip about Sadie and about her younger sister, and his podcast is called The Girls, and he winds up coming to Sadie's hometown to try and piece together what's happening. So West is kind of a few steps behind Sadie. So we see Sadie's journey, and then we see West trying to piece together what happened and sort of is hot on Sadie's trail, trying to help her and trying to find out what happened to her sister. So this one is just so tremendously well done. I read this a few years ago now, maybe 2018, I want to say, and I really loved it. And I definitely will be reading this one again, but this is really well done on so many different fronts. And for the podcast, I was trying to find an example. Like, you get the episode, you get who's talking, they're like the actual transcripts of the podcast, but it's really well done. It is definitely on the dark side. This is not sort of light, fun, think true crime podcast sort of at its core, but it's really tremendously well done. I really think it's just such a great story. I was completely hooked by it. And it is hard not to root for the characters in this story, and just sort of that propulsive feeling of needing to know how it's all going to end, but I loved it. The next book I talked about in my most recent book haul, and this is 6 Stories, and this is by Matt Wesolowski. This is One Body, 6 Stories, Which One is True? So in this one, we have 2 timelines, 1997 and 2017. So in 1997, we have the body of teenager Tom Jeffries is found at an Outward Bound center. Verdict, misadventure, but not everyone is convinced. And then in 2017, we have investigative journalist Scott King, whose podcast examinations of complicated cases have rivaled the success of Serial, with his concealed identity making him a cult internet figure. In a series of 6 interviews, King attempts to work out how the dynamics of a group of idle teenagers conspired with the sinister legends surrounding the area, Sarclaw Fell, where Tom Jeffries was found, and how that conspired together and resulted in Jeffries' mysterious death. So this one says chilling, unpredictable, startling thriller, devastating ending, but once again you have sort of the different transcripts and the interviews that take place here. I have heard that this is really great on audiobook as well, which does not surprise me in the slightest. I have not decided if I'm going to read it, listen to it, or do a little bit of both, which I'm also quite a fan of, but I'm really excited for this one. And you guys know I'm obsessed with Serial. Season 1 of Serial I thought was just absolutely tremendous. And the comparison of this to that kind of amps it up even more for me. So I will keep you guys posted when I read it, but I'm really excited for this one, and I believe this is the first in a series as well, and I think it's just sort of like any kind of true crime podcast series where there's a new mystery each book, pretty much is how it goes, but this is book number 1, so obviously starting here. The next book I have is the second book in a 3-book series, but if you haven't already started the series, maybe this will motivate you to, because trust me, it is so well worth it. So this is Good Girl, Bad Blood by Holly Jackson. So this is the second book in the Good Girl's Guide to Murder series. So in book number 1, we have our main character, Pip. She is a senior in high school, and she winds up investigating a murder that took place in her town about 5 years earlier, where a girl who was a senior at the time was murdered in the town, and her boyfriend was accused of that murder, and he wound up taking his own life. But Pip knew the boy and never believed that he was the one who did it. So she winds up investigating that murder to find out what really happened. So in book number 2, Pip is sort of expanding her investigation into other crimes and such, keeping it vague, and she winds up starting a podcast, which is where the podcast element comes into it. But you can't understand book number 2 without reading book number 1, but Good Girl's Guide to Murder is such a good book. It's such a great story. I have it over here, I think you can see it. And the audiobook, so I physically read that book and then I wound up doing the audiobook of it, because even though there's not a podcast in the first book, she does phone interviews with people, she does in-person interviews with people, and it has that very similar vibe that Sadie has, where you hear background noises and you've got the different voices and the phones ringing, and it's just a really well done audiobook. So I have not yet listened to this on audio, I only physically read it, but it was so good. And then book number 3 was great, but this is such a smart series and I really, really enjoyed it. And this is one of those books where it originally came out in the UK. So the UK edition is set in the UK, and then it came out in the US and it is set in Connecticut. So other than a few details in terms of like how our school system is different than theirs and getting into college and like a little bit of sort of things that vary by country, it's the same story. So regardless of which one you pick up, it's the same story. But anyway, take me a long time to get there. Really good book, podcast element, can't say enough great things about it, and would highly recommend it. The next book I have, Lindsay from Lindsay's Little Library recommended to me, and I haven't read it yet, but I know that I'm gonna love it because she said I will, and this is Girl 11, and this is by Amy Suter Clark. So in this one, here we come with our podcast element to it. We have a woman named Elle Castillo, and she was once trained as a social worker, supporting young victims of violent crime, but now she hosts a popular true crime podcast that focuses on cold cases of missing or murdered children. So she's been on the podcast for 4 seasons, successfully solving these cases in Minnesota's Twin Cities. So Elle decides to tackle her own white whale, the Countdown Killer. 20 years ago, TCK terrorized the community, kidnapping and ritualistically murdering 3 girls over 7 days, each a year younger than the last. But as he took his 11-year-old victim, the pattern and the murders abruptly stopped. No one has ever known why. So Elle winds up getting a tip from one of her listeners, and then also winds up discovering the man's dead body. She feels at fault. Then within days, a child is abducted, a young girl who seems to fit suspiciously into the TCK sequence. While media and law enforcement long ago concluded that TCK was dead, Elle has never believed it. She'd hoped her investigation would lay that suspicion to rest, but instead her podcast seems to be creating new victims. So understandably, Elle has a lot of guilt because this serial killer went dark, and Elle feels responsible for sort of resurrecting him, so to speak. So Lindsay said this was such a compulsive read, which makes 1000% sense because it sounds like a completely compulsive read. But same thing, you've got kind of the transcripts of the podcast that are in here, and it just sounds like a really intriguing book, and I'm very, very excited for it, and I trust Lindsay implicitly, so I will 1000% be reading this one soon. The next book I have is I Killed Zoe Spanos by Kit Frick. So I read this back in 2020 when it came out, and this is another book that I want to reread for multiple reasons. One of them being I had not read Rebecca at the time, but after the fact found out that this was an homage to Rebecca, so I want to reread it so I can see all the Easter eggs and all the hints and all the things that correlate between the two. But I very much enjoyed this book, and it's got the beautiful painted spines, which is definitely one of the reasons why I picked it up in the first place. But this book takes place out on Long Island, and we have a girl named Zoe Spanos who disappeared on New Year's Eve. So when the book opens, we meet a girl named Anna Ciccone, and she arrives in this Hamptons town for a nanny gig over the summer. And the whole town is all abuzz still about the disappearance of Zoe Spanos. And she's been missing since New Year's Eve, like I said, and Anna bears an eerie resemblance to Zoe. And her mere presence in town stirs up all these still raw feelings about the unsolved case. So Anna, of course, starts delving deeper into the mystery and stepping further and further into Zoe's life. And she becomes increasingly convinced that she and Zoe are connected and that she knows what happens on New Year's, even though she's never been to this town before. So 2 months later, Zoe's body is found in a nearby lake and Anna is charged with manslaughter. But Anna's confession is riddled with holes. So the podcast element in this is we've got a podcast called Missing Zoe, which was started by Martina Green, who is best friends with Zoe's younger sister. And she is committed to finding out what really happened, who killed Zoe, and if it wasn't Anna, can Martina's podcast uncover the truth? So same as we're seeing in all the other books, you're getting transcripts of the actual podcast in here. We have multiple timelines in this book, and I really enjoyed this one. Like, I was completely hooked on this story. It was great for a summertime read. I live in New York. I love things that are set in and around New York, and there's a little map of the town, but I feel like it has like all those perfect Hamptons vibes, and it totally captures it. You guys know I love anything in and around New York as well. Anything in and around where I've lived, New York, Boston, I'm always here for, but very much enjoyed it. It was a quick read, and I think this is gonna be like a perfect reread for this summer. I'm in such that reread vibe, so highly recommend this as well. And then the last book I have is another one I haven't read yet, and this one is Possession by Katie Lowe. So this one, we've got another unsolved mystery and a podcast that is committed to finding the truth. So 10 years ago, Hannah's husband was brutally murdered in their home, and she conveniently doesn't remember a thing about that night. But the police charged somebody else, a stranger, and put him away for life for her husband's murder. So Hannah then packed up her 6-year-old daughter and left London behind. But now her hard-won countryside peace is being threatened. So we have a podcast called Conviction, which is known for getting cases reopened and old verdicts overturned. And it's turned its attention to Hannah's husband's murder for its newest season. And the podcasts say the police framed the man who was found guilty, and that Hannah has more suspicious secrets than just her memory loss. So she's got a violent history, citations at the clinic she worked at as a psychiatrist, dependencies on pills and alcohol, and a familial-sidal grandmother, say that 3 times fast, locked away in a gothic insane asylum until her death. So Hannah loses the trust of everyone she loves, and the only person she feels she can confide in is Darcy, who is a former colleague of hers, and she's come back into her life but may have motives all her own. But even Hannah can't tell Darcy her deepest secret, that she's still tormented by the memory of her husband and the crater he carved throughout her life. So whether it is the main character is the podcaster is on the hunt for the murder, any of it. I'm such a fan of anything podcasty, so I'm really excited for this. I've not heard a lot of people talking about this book, which again, I lend to my theory of like, maybe I'm just not listening to the right people, but sounds really interesting. And it says the past haunts her, the present hunts her. I love that. These taglines, I'm total trash for taglines too, but this one sounds great. So those are just some of the books that I pulled together that feature podcasts. Let me know if you know of other books that have podcast elements to it, because I just love it so much. And I was trying to Google more books, and every time I tried to put it in, it just kept spitting out podcasts about books rather than books that have podcasts in them. So I'm always interested. So if you know of others, like I said, let me know about that. And then definitely check out the Book of the Month podcast. That link is down below. You can get your first box for $9.99 with the code SUMMER. All of that is linked down below. below. So thank you guys so much for watching, and thank you again to Book of the Month for sponsoring today's video. I just love it. It's so exciting. And if you guys like this video, like book recommendation videos, definitely give this a thumbs up. And if you're not already subscribed, give that a go as well. And I will see you guys in another video really soon. So thanks for hanging out today, and take care until next time. Bye, everybody.